Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and the last time we had this perspective on things, we were working on my European nightcrawler tray, and we had deemed the system as being ready for migration. So in other words, the composting process had finished. I'd given the worms a little bit of time to try to work down some of the smaller bits and pieces remaining in the material. And I had initiated the attempt at migrating the worms out of the finished compost. But the compost was a little bit damp, so rather than just leaving it, we had actually left the material uncovered, and the fan is attempting to just move air across the top to try to help stimulate the evaporation of the moisture in the material. It was 12 days ago that we started the process, and then 6 days ago we checked in again and we added some food to the horizontal migration feeding zone, which is covered with that red plastic on the side. And now, 6 days later, we're going to do our first extraction of worms out of here. And those worms are going to be used to launch off a new European nightcrawler bin. So let's turn off this fan, let's get the tray up on the bench, let's get to work on this. So now this is really just an intermediate step, and the finished result is an entirely evacuated batch of vermicompost on this side, and then the last of your worms having all moved over into the baiting area. So I don't expect by any means this to be the end. I've been coming in here regularly to till up this material to bring the more damp stuff down low up to the surface to expose it to the moving air with the little fan that's blowing across, and take some of the stuff that has already dried off nicely and push that down lower so that it too can absorb some of the moisture. We're gradually getting to a point where the material is a little bit more manageable, but it's certainly still a lot more damp than it needs to be. And you could clearly tell that it's nowhere near being evacuated yet. It's so cool though, no matter where I look in this material, there are just tons and tons of cocoons. So yes, I'm not talking about the worm, I'm talking about the little tiny object next to the worm. Oops, I just dropped it. But this material definitely seems to have pretty much cocoons anywhere I look. And I guess the main difference, you could tell right away, this one was a little bit darker, this one's a little bit lighter. And they get darker in color as the time passes and they get closer to the point where they're going to be able to hatch. And geez, they are literally everywhere. So I could certainly see this material benefiting from just sitting around, you know, basically not only giving the worms time to evacuate and giving the material a chance to dry to become more manageable, but also giving time for these cocoons to, you know, allow their inhabitants to emerge. So I'm not really after the castings in this case, you know. I've got sufficient castings with which to build my garden, which will be soon at this point. So I'm really just more interested in kind of the propagation aspect of what I'm doing here. You know, some people are all about the castings, you know, maybe it's still a new hobby for you and you're just, you know, anxious to get that first batch of worm castings for your spring gardening. You know, in my case, I've been doing this a little while, so I've got some of the stuff laying around in storage, and I've got, you know, an ample amount of worm castings to satisfy my needs as far as gardening and things like that. So I'm not in that anxious position to try to get my hands on the castings. I think I'm definitely more interested in having a few more European nightcrawlers added to my population. They're kind of a cool worm to have around. I've got them in my VermiBag Mini and in this tray here. And I'd like to have, I think, more, you know. I'd just like to have a couple additional systems with these types of worms. And I could certainly see maybe, you know, using the worms that come out of this tray to launch not only the system that we're going to be launching today, but maybe even another one, sort of splitting the population that's in here. I'll try to move as many adult worms as I can out of the system using this migration method, luring as many worms as I can over into this feeding area. But at some point later in the game, I might just take the remaining castings, knowing that there's still probably a bunch of worms hanging out in this stuff, as well as all of these cocoons that are scattered throughout the material, and allow that system to sort of spawn off from that starting point with some existing worms, but with the knowledge that there's going to be a whole bunch more worms hatching from their cocoons in a fairly short period of time. A whole bunch of hungry little mouths to feed. So that was kind of my game plan. That's where I think I'm going with these particular systems. Sometimes it's really a matter of just getting the finished castings totally worm-free, depopulated, and then harvesting those castings, putting them to use or whatever the case may be. And that's what I usually do, but in this case, I'm deviating from the norm a little bit. But that's the thing, there's no norm, basically, You do whatever it is that suits your particular needs at that particular time, right? So that's always the best way to go. Kind of give yourself your own requirement. What do you require? I require more European nightcrawlers at this time. Not so much what someone else might answer, which is, I need the castings, please. So I've got this tray over here. I got this little clear tray. It should be sufficient in size to hold the entire contents of what's currently making up this feeding zone area here. So I'm really just going to do nothing more than scoop this stuff out. And you can also see, if you've seen the way I set these systems up, I usually put in sort of a barrier, little cardboard strip in here that appears to be blocking access to the feeding area, but it's not. It's riddled with holes. So it's certainly designed and intended to allow for a lot of worm passage. And it seems to work quite well. So all the little tiny holes that I punched into it are allowing a good number of worms to pass through, make their way over into the feeding area to check out what's happening over here. And what's happening over here is obvious. It's the only spot in the bin that's receiving any fresh food. So besides the food that went in here to build the feeding area 12 days ago when this began, there was also the supplemental feeding 6 days ago, halfway through that 12-day stretch that this has been occurring. I did notice that the stuff that had been used originally to build this section of the bin just seemed a little bit lackluster in performance. It didn't seem like it was bringing in the crowd of worms that I had hoped it would. So during the refit, during the replenishment 6 days ago, I added a whole bunch of stuff that I think should work really well in terms of, luring the worms over. I think it was banana peels and stuff like that. So why don't we actually get to work here? I think I've already sort of set the stage for making this stuff happen, so let's get to work. The way I do this, since I know that I'm going to be rebuilding this feeding zone to help encourage this process to continue, number one, I tried to be real ginger with the dividing wall in the hopes that I could just continue using it as is, and that appears to be the case. It's still pretty much intact, so I'm going to just leave it, and it'll be the separating wall. It's more of a visual aid, if nothing else, for me to be able to see where the end of the finished castings are and where the feeding zone that I'm managing begins. It's just so much easier than just allowing it to be sort of not, it's not separated. Basically, it's not indicated as to where one ends and the other begins and stuff like that. So here, to me, this just looks like a whole bunch of worm castings that have dropped to the bottom. So rather than taking it with the worms, that's, good to stay as far as I'm concerned. Leave it in there, which is supposed to be kind of the castings side, right? And this side, which is supposed to be the worms side, is pretty much been emptied out at this point, right? So now, some of this stuff that we pulled out of here, I believe, can be reused, because it would be a shame to build a new feeding zone out of all fresh, sterile, materials, because the worms really do favor stuff that's already had a chance to break down nicely, stuff that's kind of in the process of decomposing. And by recycling as much of this stuff as possible, I think you know, significantly increase your chances of having success with your feeding zone, because you know you're doing your best to maintain a space that the worms really favor being in and are comfortable in. With that in mind in advance, I'll usually use large chunks of stuff in my feeding area. And there too, within the feeding area, I wouldn't want something really large to become sort of an obstacle that the worms can't pass around or through or whatever. So you can see, like, even these pieces of coffee filter, I punched all kinds of holes through them just to make sure that they're large like this and easy to handle and pick up as a whole object, but they're not going to become some sort of a blockade within the feeding area. They're just bedding, easy to handle, easy to extract and recycle this way. So almost all of the materials we're going to find in here, if not all the materials, are all going to be fairly large chunks from which I believe I can remove worms pretty easily, pretty quickly, and recycle and reuse. I guess here in this folded piece of paper, I'm just checking to see if any worms snuck inside. I guess since this was folded already, or whatever the case may be, this one doesn't have any holes in it. So let's improve on that there a little bit and give it a couple holes. I still think it should have the strength to be managed as a whole piece, to be recycled once again later if need be, during the next extraction of worms, which I doubt will be the last. I'm sure there will be others. After 12 days, I don't know. I think the progress we're seeing here might not be as good as we've seen in the past in some of my other migrations, and I know why. It's clear why. The material that the worms are inhabiting here is very damp, and it's very cozy, and it's still probably got a whole bunch of food scattered in it and all that other stuff. So where's their motivation to leave? What is the deal? And sometimes I'd like to think that maybe ongoing drying of the material that they're inhabiting is one reason they would want to leave it and go find something more favorable. Eventually the food will be depleted, and then that'll drive them out looking for a fresh supply of food. So one way or another, the whole objective is to see these worms get out of the finished compost so they could be put to work elsewhere on a new project. I believe on this piece of paper we're seeing some of the leftover material that I used for the original build of this feeding area. It's like a pulverized combination of veggies and fruits. I just took a bunch of the stuff that was intended to go into my freezer as worm food, but since I had so little space remaining for it, I blended it. I put it into the food processor, and I created this kind of slurry, this goo of all different types of celery and grapes and whatever else I could find. And I've been using that in certain places where I'd like to see the material break down pretty rapidly, so no large chunks ideally. I'd like to just see that as food for them, easy to digest. But to me, it always seems like if the stuff sort of cakes up and gets into a large block, then it's going to have a really hard time breaking down. For whatever reason, I guess the bacteria, microbes, everything won't really infiltrate this stuff. And unless those microorganisms make their way into the material first, the worms will generally not follow. Certain types of stuff like watermelon, whatever, the worms will jump right on that, probably mainly for the water content. And there are certain foods that do seem to draw the worms very rapidly on their own. But in most cases, what you're relying on in your worm bins is for the infiltration of all the microorganisms that inhabit the worm bin, along with your worms, to get all this stuff sort of breaking down at a microscopic level so that the worms can come in and take advantage of that already partially broken down material and consume it as food. Because in some cases they really can't do so unless that's happened first. So I always like to try to go on the assumption that, most if not all of my food does rely on that sort of pre-decomposed state so that the worms can really get into it. And that's part of the reason, for example, in the worm bin that we've created for these little guys that we're going to be relocating them into, we built the bin with a whole bunch of nice fresh bedding, sterile stuff that just came out of the shredder, or materials that I might have chopped up with the scissors or just torn by hand or whatever the case may be. But You know, all the bedding and everything that went into their new home is pretty much free of all those microorganisms. So I do take some finished compost and I dump it into the bin, and that bin has been sitting that way with all the fresh bedding as well as fresh food, is pretty much an entire environment created for them to move into and get to work on. But to get the microscopic action kick-started, I'll grab some of this finished compost and scatter it into the bin as well while I'm building it, giving the material a little bit of a head start. You know, as I continue picking through here and pulling out stuff that we could use, I feel like we've got so few worms. I was really expecting a much better turnout in here. But, you know, I don't want to delay the start of this new bin any further. We've managed to pull some worms together, and we're going to use them even though they're a little bit few in numbers. In time, we'll be able to move over their uncles and aunts and their cousins and brothers and sisters and moms and dads and the rest of the family. But right now, these are going to be the initial, I don't know what you want to call it, the early scout team. They're going to go out there and sort of lay out the lay out the new territory, survey the space, check it out, make sure it's all good, get some basic stuff set up for them, and that'll just make the place a lot more cozy for when the rest of the family is hauled over there too. So, you know, I can go on and on here, probably picking stuff out of here. It's not all that important. It's just fine if some of this goes with the worms into the new space. In fact, to a certain degree, I think it's beneficial for them to have some really familiar, comfortable materials that they can just hang out in if they really want to, or if there's anything going awry in their new space. At least they've got a little bit of existing material to occupy, which is still comfortable for them until such a time that their new space, for whatever reason, becomes comfortable too. So I just figured, you know, if there's stuff like this piece of paper where it's tearing so much anymore that the reuse of it might be more trouble than it's worth, then I think I'm just going to let it go with the worms at this point. We've collected a good amount of recyclable chunks of paper and even larger food scraps that just didn't get very far broken down. But I would have to say that, you know, other than some of those larger pieces like the banana peels and stuff, we've definitely seen these little guys put a good-sized dent into the food that was used to build up this feeding area. I mean, the foods that were used to build up the feeding area twice, right? So there was food put in here during the initial build of the feeding area, and then there was that supplemental addition of stuff. Makes me wonder if the worms are just coming over to have a little meal and then just going back out into the finished compost to hang out with all their friends and neighbors. I think if this material was a lot drier, this would be happening a lot more quickly. The bins where I have really good success with these migrations are bins where the material has had a chance to dry out a little bit, which in itself is already getting the worms pretty motivated to go find something that's a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more damp. And that's what we provide in our feeding area. There's all that food that has moisture content to it as well, but the plastic covering is applied only there too, to allow for any moisture that would attempt to evaporate to just remain there, just to condense on the overhead plastic, to drip back down and keep the feeding area nicely hydrated and nice and comfortable. So I could certainly see continuing to operate the fan to continue drying this material. Luckily, it's definitely improving, definitely is drying out, not nearly as bad as it was when we first started, but maybe that would have been a good early step, is to actually give this material more time to dry before trying to start this process, because it is a little bit lackluster. I was expecting a greater number of worms to be in here, but you know, whatever. I'm going to take it. At this point, I don't want to like put them back, you know. I figured, hey, if we've collected a certain number of these worms already, let's go ahead and relocate them into their new space. It's funny, usually the worms want to just dive down into the pile to get into nice, dark, comfortable conditions. But these little guys are trying to just crawl out of the container. So let's see if we can encourage them to stay within their material here rather than trying to flee. Because we're going to have to set this aside for a few minutes while we rebuild this feeding area, replenish the food, put it back out in front of the fan, and then we'll get the new bin that we've created for these little guys over here and release them. Oh brother, I'm wondering if I should just take this piece of paper and cover them up so that they're not so freaked out by these overhead lights. Alright, whatever. I'm going to keep an eye on that just to make sure we don't end up with a whole bunch of dead worms on the dry table. So, I'm going to get a little bit more food from the freezer. We might even sprinkle in a little extra bedding to refresh this feeding area. And then we'll level things off, and then we'll be on to releasing the worms. So the stuff that we're using is some cardboard paper. These are just more coffee filters that I tore and perforated. Here's just a few things that I think have maybe a little bit more moisture content. Cucumber, tomato, maybe not as much moisture content, but certainly a nice sugar content is the banana peel, and whatever. I just figured I'd throw some smaller scraps of shaved carrots there, carrot peelings. And I think that should make for a pretty, nice feeding area. Like I said, I like the, materials that I make it out of to be a little bit larger so they're easier to handle later on. But if there's little stuff like, whatever, carrots. I know carrots are going to attract the worms. They definitely like the carrots, so whatever. Let there be some small fragment type stuff in here too. Yeah, let's throw a little water in there too, right? Don't want to get it all drenched, but the more moisture, the better. Worms are going to love that. So let's take this. Oops. I tore my dividing wall. It's not even so much a dividing wall, it's just a marker for me, sort of. But I could tell, I could see what's going on here. Looks like we've increased the size of our feeding area here too, which I think should be fine. So let's start dropping some stuff in here. We've got little pieces of bedding. Guess we've even got some partially broken in food here. Get some of that out on the front line, but we'll put the more really tempting, worked stuff further. Put the more fresh stuff here outside. They'll have to work their way through the fresh if they really want the well broken down stuff that's probably easier to eat, but then on the way back they'll be distracted by the stuff that has since broken down and become really tasty for them. A little fresh bedding material. These are nightcrawlers, and you keep hearing how they really favor carbon-rich bedding type materials, cardboard, paper, things like that. To me, it always seemed weird. It's like, why would a worm favor some sort of a manufactured item? But it's basically wood pulp, and they just go crazy for it. So with the nightcrawlers, it definitely pays to make sure you're trying to get them worked up with stuff that's gonna, in fact, get them worked up, such as carbon-rich, paper-based type stuff. They really seem to go nuts for this stuff. It's definitely something that I preach, but I don't practice as well as I could. At least I feel that way. Let's just spread this yummy cucumber out a little bit on both sides, and we'll throw the tomato in the middle, making a little cucumber salad here. And we got a couple remaining pieces of paper and cardboard here, but we've pretty much tapped out everything that we allocated for this rebuild of the feeding area. Hopefully we can get more worms interested in what's happening over here, but it's, like I said earlier, it's not always a factor of how much you can get their interest piqued with something. It's also, creating the space that they're inhabiting presently to become less of a cozy and comfortable place to stay in. That's really all it is. You know, you're not really trying to whip them or scare them or, oh my goodness, did I miss a major migration opportunity here? I guess it's reasonable to assume that that should have been expected. So I should have paid a little more attention. We'll just bring our little shuttle box over here that we're moving the worms over in. And we'll just grab a few of them. I mean, they were all right there in a pile. I couldn't resist just enlisting their help for this as well. There's another cocoon. They're just everywhere. It's awesome. I love it. But you know what? Before we go any further, let's just take a peek in between the layers here too, if we can. Or maybe just we got lucky. I think we just got lucky where those two layers just happened to delaminate and there was a whole bunch of worms there. We just might not have that kind of same delamination elsewhere and shouldn't expect to see the same thing over there either. But it was worth a look just in case. It could have been. What could have been, but might not have been. So yeah, we got a few worms here, but not a huge amount. I'm all right with that. It was actually a thing that I've been interested in. You keep hearing these examples of people who take a dozen or so worms, you know, just a handful of worms, 10 or 20 or whatever, and they launch off an entirely new worm bin with so few worms, letting the worms, you know, multiply and expand their numbers just based on that small, tiny initial sized population. And then it becomes a full-fledged worm bin over, you know, a couple generations of worms reproducing and spreading their numbers, increasing their numbers, and spreading out their population. So this is definitely going back. Oh, look at all these worms. This is definitely going back in front of the fan. Let it continue drying the stuff that we've surfaced here, which is a little more damp than the dry stuff that was on top when we first got started. So I could tell the fan blowing across is helping a lot. But you know, none of this stuff is crumbling apart yet. It's all just big wads of who knows what. You know, some of these wads actually have like a piece of uncomposted material in them too. So I'm sure that a lot of this stuff is still just uneaten food clumped up with castings and stuff just because of the excess moisture. I got a feeling this stuff is going to become really, really nice really, really quick. So we're going to have to take your little cozy cover blanket away, guys. Sorry. Just dive down into the castings. You'll be fine. Alright. I think this paper did its job, right? Keeping the worms from freaking out from the bright lights. But there was that little chance that we had to watch them experimenting, climbing the walls a little bit, checking to see if there's a way to go venture away from home base, find new digs somewhere else. But most of them didn't appreciate the dryness of the air, the surrounding air out in the walls of the container. I must admit though, in that little time lapse that we saw earlier, I did cheat towards the end. I stood over the bin for a few minutes, just gently blowing, exhaling onto the worms as they were experimenting with the perimeter of the container. And I think that extra airflow, you know, caused them to just not want to be there. So they usually turned tail and headed back down. I even had one that was already kind of over the edge, and that was the one that actually got me started. I didn't want them coming out. I don't think that one shows up in the time lapse because it was on the opposite side of the container. But all right, don't worry, guys. We'll have you out of that box shortly in your new home. So let's see, the greater amount of moisture is here, so that's the side that was pretty much entirely covered with plastic. This side, you know, you can't really entirely cover it, so a little bit of air is going to get in underneath from the side. But over on this side, over here, where I can really neatly place the plastic up against the wall all the way around, pretty much limiting the airflow around the edges entirely, we get a really nice, cozy, damp spot going down there. This over here will be placed in front of the fan. Let it continue drying. Let's go get that new system out here that we can release our worms into. Now here in this new bin that I created for these worms a few days ago, there's really nothing out of the ordinary. It's pretty much my basic setup. The cardboard here on top usually is just meant to prevent excess light from passing through the plastic that's right beneath it, resulting in a nice dark, cozy place for the worms to hang out. If you're using a plastic material that's opaque, then I guess it wouldn't make much difference because it's not letting any light through anyway. But a lot of times I'm using translucent or transparent plastic that does allow a good amount of light through. So during the day when the sun shines into my wormery, I wouldn't want to discourage the worms from hanging out on the top surface, which is a place they like to be, just because there's light or bright lights. I don't know if you could see, there's droplets of water here. Great example of why I cover up with a plastic sheet is because all those droplets of water would have just evaporated out into the air if there was some sort of a material there that didn't block its movement. There's so much of it that's actually like dripping off as I remove the plastic. I had some leftover plastic cut up garbage bags. I figured I'd try to cover one because I knew I'd get really good edge-to-edge coverage with that. It's a little long on the sides. If I continue to use those pieces of plastic as covering, then I'll probably trim them down to make them a little bit more manageable. If anyone's interested in seeing how I built this bin, I did create a video about it. Just a really quick 3-minute time lapse where I don't even discuss anything or talk. I think I put some music behind it or something. It's just a really fast motion playback of this bin being built from scratch, start to finish. So for the release of our worms, they're right over here, probably anxious to get out of this bright light. So we'll give them a spot to dive down into in a moment. It does seem like if all I need to do is tip this over, they should be good to go. Maybe I'll try to reveal some of them so we can get a better view of how many there are here. Because I like to, at least get a visual guesstimate of the number of worms I've got. Sometimes if you've got a pile of worms only, then you could weigh them based on their weight, have a pretty good estimate of their quantities. But, with them inhabiting a pile of castings and foodstuffs and bedding and whatever else that's in this, it's really tough to tell how many they are. So yeah, maybe we'll be able to tell better when we release them. I'm going to switch the camera over into time-lapse, get these little guys released, and we'll take it from there. Well, some worms like this one over here, you can just kind of wait forever for them to finish getting off the surface. But we've allowed for, 99% of the other worms to seek shelter from the bright light. If that one wants to get a tan because he's so pale, then that's fine. Let him do it. But that's pretty much all there is to it. Here, let's kind of make it official, right? I've got, oh, here it is. I've got the sticker, which makes it official. The newest of our bins. It's the ENC bin from today's date. So I'm gonna cover up the bin here. I could do that while I'm talking. But that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. As for the other tray, the one that we got the worms out of originally, well, that's down here on the ground. It's just going to sit over here, left to dry. If I can, I'll try to get that fan over there working again, except it's making a whole bunch of weird noises when I tried turning it on a moment ago. But we'll figure it out. So that's it, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.